institutional reform, in a sense, was a latecomer theme, but it has not been a theme that was not there in previous deliberations. It's a very important theme, and in our context, we have to think very carefully about this. If transitional justice processes are anything, they're something about dealing with history. So we're dealing with a long and complicated history. We're not merely dealing with the structure of the state as it is today. We're dealing with the structure of the state and the evolution of the state and the state institutions over a very long period of time. And we have to note that one of the things we are doing today, I suppose in the field of human rights and transitional justice, could be called slight insanity. I don't know of many transitional justice processes that begin before the conflict is over. Most of them are post-conflict arrangements for very obvious reasons. And therefore, when we begin to do our deliberations and we begin to think about institutional reform, we must understand that today we exist still in a state of conflict. And I want to say a little bit more about that in a minute. And in the current conflict, we see, and we have lots of conversation about this, in the conflict between regime and state. Is the state an independent set of institutions facilitating things for the citizens, or is it something wholly captured by the regime? Now, this may feel a novel problem, but actually it's a problem that's bedeviled our country for, I think, all my lived life. And I want to do a little exercise here. I want you to put up your hands if you were born after 1980. Anybody who was born after 1980? Okay, right, you can put your hands down. Everybody who was born before 1980? Okay, yeah, it's even balance. Everybody who was born before 1970? Aha. Everybody who was born before 1960? Everybody who was born before 1950? Wow. The little exercise is to show us the span of which we have people who have lived through periods of gross human rights and violence, and of the evolution of the state that perpetrated those things. Now, I'm saying that because memory in human beings is very contextual. It depends on who you are, where you were born, and when you were born. So we have to see that the problems we deal with in the state are not merely the state today, but the evolution of the state over a long period of time. The regime that controlled the colonial state and the colonial state was not a state that was set up for all citizens in this country. It's why we had a particularly unpleasant war. That state became an illegitimate state in 1965, and therefore became a much more predatory state, if I can use that word, in the eyes of the majority. And after that, we have had the growth of a new state, and we want to make some remarks about that. A state that came an independent state, but has gradually evolved into what I think respected political commentators will now call a predatory state. And there's some remarks about that in the handout that we do. I don't intend to go into the details of that. But what is important to see about these state institutions is that there always have been challenges to the excesses of the state. They go back a long way. They go back in civil movements through these periods, the 50s and the 60s, challenging the unfairness and the racist nature of the state. In the 70s, the Catholic Commission for Justice and Peace did very good, assiduous, and brave work to expose the human rights violations that were being perpetrated by the state. In the 80s, again the Catholic Commission attempted to expose the gross human rights violations that were taking place in the southern half of our country. And that culminated in a very important report, a report that too often is referred to as the CCJP report. And in all fairness, and this is where history is very important, it was the Legal Resources Foundation and the Catholic Commission. It is important because when we lose our sense of history, we lose some meaning for it. So the legal resources were an important player in that. So there were conversations developing about the nature of the state and the reforms that were necessary. There were public discussions. I think in 1998, J.J. Moyer will remember, I think it was 1998, we held the first public discussion on Gukurahundi in Bulawayo, 98. That was the first time we began to speak publicly about something that was very difficult. And this is a context for us again today. But for a very important development in 2003, and this meeting today is the logical, consistent development of that, was a conference held in Johannesburg, and many people were at that conference, where Zimbabwean civil society came together with international experts, and in that symposium crafted a good description of the territory that needed to be covered by of transitional justice. And those of you who were there and those of you who've bothered to read that very important document will see that what we said was that we had to consider the problems of the state from all the way back to the arrival of settlers in the 1890s. How we were going to do that, we weren't sure, and that's where some of these principles are important. But it was important that we considered the entire history of the nation. And that was endorsed in 2004 in another meeting in Harare, and has been built on by initiatives of the Human Rights Forum and other groups of beginning to consult the citizens themselves, the victims themselves, as to what they think transitional justice should look like. And what you will notice from that is we have some very eccentric views of what periods of history are relevant. The point of mine making was, of making the reference to age, is the young very often don't care about old history. If we've asked, excuse me, if we've asked the young people often born after 1980, what's important is the period after independence. And the younger they get, the more they focus on the period around 2000. If you ask people in Matabeleland, the events of the 1980s are very central to what has happened to them. And to a lot of very elderly people, some of us remember the Liberation War, and some people here participated in the Liberation War, that is a very important period as well. That is also part of this discourse. So we end up here taking this very brave initiative to look at how we deal with the state and what reforms are necessary to deal with the state. But whatever happens about the history, we now stand at a particular point in 2015 in a very, very complicated political situation. Michael Bratton and Eldred Musunangure and other people have described Zimbabwe as a predatory state, not merely a totalitarian state. They talk about it in very, very informed ways. I'm just going to briefly read it because I think it's important to raise these issues, because it's the context in which we must realistically address this problem. Transitional justice has to be realistic and not idealistic. The features that they talk about are centralized political power mediated through a very narrow coalition. You don't have to make notes, it's in here. The use of this power to control economic resources, to control all the economic resources, in a highly discretionary fashion. The failure to use those resources for any observable developmental purpose. The absence of any vision or commitment to promote long-term sustainable growth development, or the systematic provision of public goods. there should be lights going off in your head saying tick, tick, tick. A ruthless application of coercion and repression to gain and especially maintain power. The use of a mixture of fear and reward as a means of retaining the loyalty of immediate followers and supporters. The use of often considerable brutality and exclusion as the means for punishing opponents or competitors. Excuse me. The systematic erosion of both public institutions, the rule of law, and the transgression of customary institutions, and a consequent degradation of the economy. We would submit that that's the position in which we find ourselves today. And it is bolstered, as we have demonstrated amongst us, by repressive machinery of considerable sophistication and organization. Now, I'm making these remarks because I think we need a very clear sense of realism when you raise the issue of the reform of state institutions as to where we are today. So, we have nonetheless, within that framework, and with the help of the Secretariat, who I think have done a very good job, begun to talk about what might be the guiding principles for institutional reform. Now, there's a considerable amount of international experience. Zimbabwe is not the first country to ever meet this, and many countries have done that. And there's good experience out there, but one shoe does not fit all, and all circumstances are different. For example, many of us here have had enormous exposure to the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And there's an enormous, and excuse me for saying this, there's a great legend about the TRC, about how it really made an enormous difference to the transformation of the South African society. Mahmoud Mandami points out that probably the CODESA creation of a political settlement in South Africa was infinitely more important than that. When the National Party and the ANC and the opposition parties got together to make a settlement about how politics would work, how the rules of the game would operate, and how the state would be transformed, that led to the lasting changes that you see in South Africa. So political settlement is sometimes critical, and I don't see that we've ever had a lasting or comprehensive political settlement in the history of this nation. So we need to think about those kinds of factors. So best practices have to be built on political settlement. But that does not mean that we as Zimbabweans cannot consider the experience of others elsewhere, look at them in our context, and begin to think about how we begin to think about the reform of our institutions of state. And you'll see that there are many different areas that we consider in this. The one that I'm referring to in more general terms, we talk about a structural reform. What needs to be reformed in Zimbabwe? What institutions have to be changed? Well, in a predatory state, virtually all, because it's captured virtually every institution. And all of us who've been working on human rights violations have noticed the enormous range of state institutions that have been directly involved in the perpetration of gross human rights violations, complicit in them, even supportive of them. So we're talking about an enormous range of structures that we need to begin to discuss. And with a problem that large, we have to be practical. You can't say, we'll grab it all and fix it all. You have to be practical. We have to begin discussions about where can we start in this process of reform. Allied to that is quite clearly legal reform. Now, one of the advantages we have, I suggest, is our new constitution. Warts and all, it still has immensely two great powers in the hands of the executive, but it offers many, many, many possibilities for looking at the nature of how institutions need to be reformed and the laws that apply to that. Actually, many of the laws that operate should constrain the state. The state just merely ignores them. Here I would think, for example, of the Police Act or the Traditional Leaders Act. It's very clear how both the police and traditional leaders should act. But we now have a constitution that underpins that. So we have a framework that we all worked very hard at doing it, and a framework within which we can begin to think about legal reform. What are we going to reform? Which laws? How are we going to approach that?